Welcome. I'm Val Hawkins, Chair of Agenda Alexandria. In our 24th season, Agenda Alexandria is our community's premier organization that explores the issues that our city faces without taking sides. In fact, our motto is taking a look without taking sides. Today, we have a very special, timely, and relevant program of high interest to the community. Sea change for Alexandria. Climate change prompts flood of problems. We'd like to thank those who have worked to organize and execute our program today. Michael Lee Pope, who will moderate the program, Eileen Ahern, Pat Miller, Ricardo Alfaro, our chair and producer, and special thanks to Amanda Buckley from the Art League for giving us technical support from here at the Art League remote studio. As we close our 24th season, which has certainly been unique and challenging with the pandemic, we think that we have dealt with all of the challenges quite well and produced a first-rate program over the year. We're very proud of what we've been able to accomplish in these very challenging times. Special thanks to our program sponsors for the year, Simpson Development, Homes of Alexandria Compass, the Zebra newspaper, and our supporting members and sustaining contributors. And finally, we are most appreciative of our great panelists who have graciously given their time and thought to address this important subject. Michael will introduce them after this message.
Welcome to Agenda Alexandria. Welcome to a live, in-person panel discussion. We're so excited to be coming to you from the Art League. We've all been vaccinated. We're socially distanced here in the Art League, and we're going to talk about an issue that has flooded Alexandria in recent years, and that is the problem of flooding. We have a dynamite panel, and I'm going to introduce our panelists here, and we're joined by the founder of Drain ALX, Katie Waynick. Thank you for joining us. We're also joined by the Global Environmental Change Specialist, who's also the former Vice Mayor of Alexandria, Andrew Macdonald. Thank you for joining us. We're joined by the Managing Director of the Old Town Business Association, who's also a member of the, get ready for it, Ad Hoc Stormwater Flood Mitigation Committee, Charlotte Hall. Thanks for joining us. And of course, the City's Director of Transportation and Environmental Services, Jan Lambert. So thank you so much for joining us. So Katie, I want to start with you. You're kind of the rock star of this issue. You created this group that started this conversation and has really made a, shall I say it, a sea change here in Alexandria. Tell us your story of what happened in your neck of the woods there in Delray and how it prompted you to create this group and how that's played out.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so my street, my neighborhood was pretty heavily impacted by the 3 storms that have occurred between 2019 and 2020. And in July of 2020, I saw how much work my neighbors and I had done to try to mitigate against some of these things on our own properties and just dove in. I wanted to learn whatever I could. I wanted to see what resources were out there. Anytime we called, we kept hearing, you know, it's a known issue. So we're like, great, fantastic. We're a known issue. What does that mean? And that kind of spurred me just to keep learning. What do we know? What are the next steps? Just all the questions. And basically, a very simple neighborhood email essentially has kind of grown organically into what you see today. So word of mouth, people passing emails along, that email list has gone from a few neighbors to over 300 people throughout the city that represent a little over 20 neighborhoods. So, you know, mostly Delray and Rosemont, but we also have some people in the West End represented. There are people Potomac Yards, Seminary Hill, Northridge. Just the one contributing thing that seemed to tie us all together is we all do experience, whether it be surface level flooding or sewage backups, and we're all just trying to learn what we can moving forward. How does the infrastructure play a role in that? Is it culvert related? Is it pipe related? So it's a lot of people learning sort of as we go, but it has gotten much bigger, I think, even than I could have anticipated a year ago. So that's the short version.
Okay, I should have mentioned at the outset, if you want to ask a question, there are two ways to do it. You can use the hashtag on Twitter, DrainALX. I totally stole Katie's hashtag, DrainALX, and used it for our purposes. So you can do it that way. You can also go to the Agenda Alexandria website, agendaalexandria.com, is it .com or whatever the Agenda Alexandria /live. And that's how you can submit a question. We definitely want your questions. We will be asking them if you have them to submit. So, but I've got a question for Jan Lambert, who's sitting over here, socially distanced to my right. The city, back in 2016, had a study where they looked at all this stuff, and I guess the people that put that study together had a long list of projects that were very expensive projects. Talk about why that study was done and how many of those projects have been accomplished.
Well, thanks, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I think the study that you're talking about is the city's capacity analysis, where we took a closer look at the city's stormwater system throughout all 8 of the watersheds throughout the city. And, Alexandria, like any older city, has had challenges with our infrastructure. Making sure that we adequately fund the maintenance and upkeep and improvements for all of our infrastructure for years has been something that the city has had to make concerted efforts in over time. And back in 2016, when we actually published the capacity analysis, it was really a time when the city was most focused really on what was happening here in Old Town. And with the combined sewer outfalls, there was a lot of attention being paid to water quality. That was also the time at which the city proposed, right after that time was when the city proposed a fee, the stormwater utility fee, which would enable us to make some of the improvements that we have known that we have needed to make for quite some time now. So the city's approach is a holistic one when we're talking about managing stormwater. We are having to not only make capacity improvements to our existing system. We have 190 miles of pipe in the city, 11,000 structures in the city that we have to maintain, 26 miles of streams and channels. All of this is part of the system that helps us manage water. And so the city makes and has made big investments in improving certain elements of the system. But we also know that certain parts of the city, particularly some of the areas that Katie has mentioned, parts of 4 Mile Run, parts of Del Rey, parts of Rosemont, really the older parts of the city. These are storm sewers that were built in the 1930s and the 1940s, and those are very challenging areas for us to make investments. And I would add that I also live in Del Rey, and my basement also had 6 inches of water after one of the events back in September, so I very acutely feel what many of us are going through in the city. It's not fun.
Now, you mentioned that there are several watersheds. I think, did you say 8 watersheds
Yes,
in the city?
right.
Okay, but there are really 2 of them that are a problem, right? Talk about those 2 watersheds.
Well, so that's a good point. So I think the city has identified capacity problems all over the city. But the 2 watersheds that are of the most concern really for us are the 4 Mile and the Hoofs Run watersheds. 4 Mile watershed, clearly the city has made investments in 4 Mile Run itself. We've made big investments making sure that channel continues to flow. That is a very important flood channel for the city, so we dredge that channel. We remove sediment from that channel over time. We've made big improvements in that channel. The Hoofs Run sewer shed is also important because a big chunk of the city in Del Rey and Rosemont drain to a big culvert that runs through Hoofs Run. And actually, you should Google Hoofs Run on the city's website, and you can actually see that Hoofs Run has been a challenge for the city, sort of managing water and sort of managing the throughput of water. And Hoofs Run has been a long-standing challenge for the community. But those are the 2 areas of the city that need the biggest investments. And what the city has done more recently, particularly with our Flood Action Alexandria program, is we've dramatically ratcheted up the amount of money that'll be going into stormwater management. We've increased it by about 450%. And what that's going to enable us to do is make those big investments in the pipes and the detention facilities that we need to have in the ground to manage all this new rainfall that we're now dealing with. And the rainfall that we're dealing with, I think most people in the city who have dealt with flooding, clearly we've got nuisance flooding in Old Town, dealing with that for decades. And most of the events that people are familiar with are tropical events. They're associated with some sort of a storm or a hurricane system. But over the last few years, what we've been seeing is that the intensity of some of the summertime storms that we're seeing is so great, and there's so much water coming down in such a short period of time, that portions of the city's existing storm sewer system, particularly in the oldest parts of the city, are just overwhelmed, and the entire system backs up. The storm sewer itself surcharges. It surcharges into the sanitary system. The sanitary system backs up into people's basements. And so holistically, we've got some big systemic problems that we've got to deal with.
So these big systemic problems have been around for many, many years, and the city did not tackle them 20 years ago, 10 years ago, which brings me to you, Andrew Macdonald, who served on the city council. When you and I were talking about this program beforehand, I asked you, do you think it was a mistake in your time on city council that the city did not make these investments 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Looking back on it now with the benefit of hindsight, was that a mistake?
Well, of course. I mean, I think the problems now have really been ratcheted up with, with the concerns about climate change. But I remember going over to Timber Branch, which is a tributary of Hoofs Run, when I was on city council, and people had a lot of sheet flow, overland flow from from the stream channel, and that continues to today. I think, again, I mean, Jan mentioned some of the issues. We're focusing heavily on the, some of the combined sewer system, at least in a piecemeal fashion. But we weren't putting enough money into maintaining the infrastructure, increasing its carrying capacity, and I would argue looking at the land use issues, because really a lot of the things we're talking about, the root cause is land use, it's development. I mean, an increase in impermeable surfaces. In other words, about, I think, over 40% of the land area of Alexandria now, and all of these 8 watersheds, it varies a little bit, is now paved. So when you have water running down and landing on a surface, instead of being absorbed into the ground as it used to be, it now runs off very quickly. So we're seeing an increase in flooding frequency, and we're seeing an increase in the size of the storms. So this is overwhelming everything. It's overwhelming all the, the infrastructure, the gray infrastructure of the city, so-called, the pipes, the 200 miles of pipes. But it's also overwhelming the stream channels and eroding them. And so it's a problem that we need to look at, as Jan has pointed out, in a very holistic fashion. And I would argue we need to look at it in terms of not just flooding issues, but in terms of water quality issues, and in terms of really looking now 50 years down the road, because climate change really is going to be a 50, 100-year problem at the minimum. So everything we do now has to be really future-oriented, and I think that's what's really the root of everything that has to go forward from this point on.
So I want to bring Charlotte in, but before we do, you said something I'm going to sort of see if Jan agrees with or disagrees with, which is the root cause is development. Is that true?
Well, clearly, anytime urbanization it's change, right? So I think clearly more concrete change, roads, all of those things add up. But I agree with Andrew, right? About 40% of the city is impervious. But something that's important to take away is that particularly since the 1990s, when the city began adopting more stringent stormwater ordinances than some of our neighboring jurisdictions, and particularly over the last couple of years, as we have been really ratcheting up our requirements of new development, the new development that's occurring is actually, in many respects, making things better for us. It's hard to do it on a systemic level, right? We are asking each site to make sure that when they are building, they are not making they're not adding to stormwater problems downstream. And so particularly some of this new development, some of the bigger multifamily and the transit-oriented development that we're seeing, when they develop, we ask them to build what are called best management practices or detention facilities and improve the water quality and improve how we're dealing with the runoff that's landing on the site. So the more recent development is actually very beneficial for us. And I think it's important to make sure that we point that out.
So speaking of recent developments, we have recently increased, I think it was doubled, the stormwater utility fee. Is that what it's called? Stormwater utility? Okay. And there was some skepticism about increasing this fee in terms of the transparency and the sort of oversight. So there was a board that was created that Charlotte Hall is a member of. I'm going to look at my notes here because it's called the Ad Hoc Stormwater Flood Mitigation Committee. That's a mouthful. I recognize your committee has not met yet, Charlotte. Here,
Thank
but
you.
what kind of oversight do you hope to put over this new, well, I should say it this way, what kind of oversight would you like to see over this pot of money that's being raised now from taxpayers in the city?
I think it's called working collaboratively and in partnership with the city. You know, reviewing what's being proposed, reviewing the ideas that the staff has, any consultants have. I think we need to be smarter, work smarter, and be wiser about what we're looking at. So we will be responsible for digesting, reviewing all the information that staff has on their plans moving forward for this plan. We'll be creating an annual report. We'll be together for 1 year, and I'm looking forward to it. I have found a recent ad hoc group that I sat on. I found it to be very beneficial for the community. It was a real partnership with the residents, the business community, and city staff and city management. And I'm looking forward to it. I think we'll be able to make a difference. I think we'll be able to be the ears and the eyes of so many people who maybe weren't heard before. I think it'll be a real education process. We'll all learn a lot as we go through it.
So also a member of this ad hoc group is Katie Waynick. You're also a member of this group, right? Katie, I want to get your reaction to something that Jan just said a minute ago, which is these newer developments help solve the problem. What's the thinking out in Delray? He mentioned he lives in Delray, so I guess it's also his thinking. But what's the thinking out in Delray in these areas that have the persistent flooding problems about development in Alexandria? And what kind of reaction would you get from your neighbors if you said to them what Jan just said, which is these new developments are actually helping solve the problem? What would be the reaction of your neighbors to that?
So I actually really appreciate the way that he described it, because I think that more often than not we hear that developers are required to make things better. And the first thing I think many of my neighbors would say after looking into this is that there's actually no code requirement. They are heavily, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, they are heavily negotiated suggestions that the city works with the developer to come to. And so I think the first thing you hear a lot of neighbors say is that there needs to be some kind of baseline requirement that's written into code that we say, this needs to be something that is not negotiable, because it does need to be better. And if you're coming into an area that is already known to have issues, how do we know that? A great example, there's a proposal for the corner of Mount Vernon Avenue and Glebe Road, I believe, and they're going to bring about 500 units in. And most of the neighbors are fine with the development because, frankly, it's going to be a big win for affordable housing if it goes through. The problem that a lot of neighbors worry about, though, is that when you look at city maps on the sewer network here in the city, the runoff for the storm and the sewer goes right through two areas. Well, either path would take through an area that's known to have sewage backups as well as stormwater backups where water's coming out of drains. So I think most neighbors would say, number one, there needs to be a code that makes there be a baseline to where this isn't something that has a lot of wiggle room. I think the second thing would be back to a point that was made earlier, that we need to be looking ahead to design standards that are above and beyond the 10-year standard, because that's the level right now that we're talking about. And if you look at the Braddock West development that was recently debated and came back to council, there was actually a question asked that said, how is this going to help this 1 acre of land that is known and has been known for a very long time to have issues? And the answer was, well, theoretically it should help, but you probably won't be able to tell because the design standard's a 10-year storm, and the storms that are really impacting these neighborhoods are the 50, the 100-year storms. And so I think if, we know the trajectory of the city is going to be development, especially when you're getting around the transportation corridors, and a lot of the old neighborhoods back up to those corridors. So how can we work together, again, to find this common ground to say, okay, this property is going to be developed. How do we make it so that the rest of the neighborhood's not even more negatively impacted? How can we make it help the neighborhood? And so I think that's what you would hear. I know when we talk about the development specifically around the Arlandria, Chirlagua neighborhood, people want to see that neighborhood preserved and the people that are there be able to stay there. So that development has a lot of really great attributes to that. The question is, how does that get built without sending more sewage into people's homes?
Andrew Macdonald, you raised this issue of development. Do you think over sort of the arc of the last 20 years, 25, 30 years, that the city has taken an approach to development and developers that ultimately has been a problem?
Well, I think, Katie raised some points about development standards. In other words, design standards for all the piping and the carrying capacity. As I understand it, Virginia's stormwater law gives local jurisdictions, because we're a Dillon state, a great deal of leeway to come up with some pretty rigorous standards for both controlling water and quantity. In other words, water quality and quantity, the two issues that are related to stormwater. So actually, I think the city has quite a bit of wiggle room in terms of what it does, especially as now we're beginning to look at future impacts, on the community and trying to figure out what else do we need to do to make this system, capable of reducing, all the higher rainfalls that we expect down the road. So I think it's partly that we haven't realized we didn't realize the impact of all this development exactly on these systems. And then to Jan's point, we waited too long to sort of readdress some of the mixed design standards of all this piping. So for instance, we may have an overall design standard of a 10-year storm for a 24-hour duration, but these storms are coming in now, maybe a 10-year storm, dumping it in 3 hours or something like that. So the problem is now we have to figure out how to, I think, increase and ratchet up the standards for all these new developments, such that we're beginning to keep pace with some of the global climate change models that are going to show, increased temperatures and increased water flow and the like. So I guess my message is this: I think the city can do a lot more than it has done, and I'm not blaming them for not doing more before, but I think now is the time for us to really evaluate the kinds of standards we have so that we're preparing for even situations that are going to be even worse. And in this context, it's not that development is bad, but we need to make sure that the stormwater that comes off development is clean, and we need to reduce it to the maximum extent possible. So the carrying capacity, so all this money we're spending, we're never going to be able to build the biggest pipes in the world. So we've got to prevent some of this runoff from ever entering the pipes. And I noticed, just to, maybe Jan can speak to this, that DC has this thing where developers can actually buy credits and do things elsewhere in the city. So I think there's a lot of innovative things that we can do to address this problem, in addition, to all the maintenance and carrying capacity work that we need to do on the existing systems. And while the problems may be greatest in Hoofs Run and 4 Mile Run watershed, they're a little bit all over the city, and they affect things in different way. For instance, the Taylor Run one affects Taylor Run, which runs through Chinkapin Park. So even stream restoration is part of this discussion. So we need to look at these problems in a watershed by watershed, scale in order to have, I think, real lasting impact on these problems, so we don't keep coming back to them.
Well, you kind of set up a question for Jan Lambert, and we'll get to that here, but I also want the panelists to feel free to ask each other questions too, so this is not just me asking questions. So Katie, feel free to throw any questions you've got. Let's go to two things that were raised there. One of them was the design standards, and the other was the 10-year storm. Jan, are the design standards the city has flexible? Should they be changed? You know, sort of what's your reaction to that? And on the 10-year storm, is that something we should be preparing for the 100-year storm instead of the 10-year storm?
Yeah, so great questions, and I'm going to come back around to a few of the things that you both raised, but I think is really helpful to discuss. So yes, I think that the city absolutely we are looking at our design standards, in particular when you look at the waterfront and you look at how we're getting ready to build and invest $100 million on the waterfront. And we've had plans that have been in place for almost a decade, and those plans were largely gray infrastructure, and particularly over the past few years as we have been changing the way that we look at water, and that looking at water as an amenity on the waterfront, not as necessarily something that we've got to design against, but also to understand that the way that rain events are occurring now is that they can be more frequent and they can be more intense. And so absolutely, the city has taken a closer look at its design standards for that capital project, and we are increasing the plan, what the investment will be. Now that also means we're going to have to spend a little bit more time assessing what we're ultimately going to build, and it may mean that we have to push back the delivery of that, but I think we all think that that's really important, because we've got issues on the waterfront, we've got nuisance issues on the waterfront, but we also have systemic issues that flood people's businesses and homes, and we need to make sure that as we're building our infrastructure that we are addressing those things. The city does have actually a fair amount of teeth when we're doing development review, and that's actually one of the things that we really look forward to when we bring the ad hoc group together, is sort of talking with you all and explaining to you sort of how we do manage stormwater now and how we manage it in the development process.
But that's not codified, right? I think the point that she was making, make your point again, that it's not actually in the code, it's more soft power as opposed to.
Well, so I know I've personally tried to find an ordinance or a code, and I've asked about it, and I've not gotten a response. But I also know, referring back to Braddock West, there was a specific question, I think from Councilman Chapman, asking the 30% reduction in runoff from Braddock West. Was that at the benevolence of the developer, or was that something that
they went above and beyond? So that was a good example.
And that's that. I think if anyone has time to watch that conversation, it has so much just fantastic information on this subject. It was really helpful. But the answer was, we worked together on this to come to this answer, but no, it's not in code. And so that was actually one thing I would like to have clarified, because I've yet to be able to see a code or ordinance, and I'd love to know what that looks like.
Should it be in the code?
Well, so a lot of it is in the code, and I think we'll go back when we pull you together for the ad hoc group. We'll show you what's in the code and how we make sure that how we require that developers address both water quality and water quantity. We have very specific standards for both, and then the city also does things like we issue memos to industry, and we tell the industry we're only actually going to allow you to install a certain type of best management practice on the site, because we don't want you to use certain older kinds, because they actually don't help us with the water quality and even the quantity improvement. So I think suffice to say it's very complicated. Cool. But going all the way back to something I think that we have been talking about is that getting out in front of this, it's very heartening for us all to be here today and talk about this and talk about where we go from here. But we're not alone in terms of the challenge in making investments in our aging infrastructure and in the stuff that's underground. And those of us who've been with the city for a little while remember, we've had a couple of different stormwater groups that we've brought together. We've had some conversations about this over time. And when you're talking about making the size of investment that we have to make, it's hard for people to do that. It's really difficult. And I remember even back in 2017 when we were talking about the stormwater utility, I remember articles in the Wall Street Journal, opinions in the Wall Street Journal. Do you remember people were talking about the rain tax and how we didn't want to see a rain tax imposed, right? So our perception of how we deal with these problems is changing, particularly as the problems are becoming more acute. And so I think that's why I'm really glad to hear Andrew say it's time for us to really sort of roll our sleeves up and we've got a big job ahead of us that's going to keep a lot of people very busy for a long. I keep telling people that I work with, for young engineers, like if you're going to go into something right now, go into water.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work for us to do.
So you mentioned in 2016 the discussion was really about the rain tax. Since then, sort of the perspective of the problem has changed, and now we've come upon this moment where we're doubling the stormwater utility fee. Perhaps you could even call it a watershed moment. Maybe you could call it that. Charlotte, you're part of this group that's going to look at where this money is going, and I think the creation of that group was an indication that there's some skepticism about how that money would be used. What's your read on how people in Alexandria view how the city has used its money and might use that money in the future?
Well, times are changing, and I think the more and more we collaborate and we have representatives from the different groups, and that's what this ad hoc group is all about. And
Which groups are represented on the committee?
I'm going to
Well,
look
just generally speaking, I didn't mean like
Neighborhoods,
entirely.
business.
neighborhoods, businesses,
Yeah.
people who, people who
Industry
have say
experts. Yeah.
Industry.
in
that's
what's
right.
going on. And again, my experience from a more recent ad hoc group is we learned a lot. Staff learned a lot, the committee learned a lot, we shared a lot. We didn't always like what we heard, we didn't necessarily agree, but you were putting your cards on the table and you were really digging deep into the heart of some of these things. And to me, it's a very open book when you're sitting around the table with representatives from the different groups. And small group, but a hearty group. Intelligent questions, and you get into the nitty gritty. So it'll be a watershed moment.
So speaking of the nitty gritty, Andrew Macdonald, I want to ask you about green infrastructure. Do you think the city has done enough of this sort of stuff with green roofs and is there something called blue roads I was reading about today? I've never heard of blue roads. Like, has the city taken this seriously enough and putting these kinds of things in the city?
Well, I think the city has taken it seriously, but I think that we now need to take it even much more seriously. And I sort of mentioned this before, is that we can improve all the infrastructure, the piping, the gray infrastructure as it's called. We can maintain it, we can increase carrying capacity, we can even change design standards, work with all the things that go wrong with that system. But at the same time, we've got to figure out a way to start with climate change, all the predictions of these regional and now local climate models, which show more flooding, higher precipitation events, 100-year storms may be becoming not the 1 in 101% probability of a year, but more probable. We've got to somehow figure out how to reduce water that runs into these systems from everywhere, from everybody's home to every business to all new development and old development. So we need to broaden the way in which we attack the problem. And in so doing, I mean, just if you have a lawn, for instance, I mean, lawns are not pavement, but they're also not completely permeable. All the water is not running into the ground, and it can be carrying off all the fertilizers that you put on your lawn. So we all have a role to play in this. So I think the city should, I don't know how much they're spending at the current time on quote unquote green infrastructure. It could be a little bioretention pond, it could be a green roof, it could be permeable pavers, it could be all sorts of things. But I think we need to increase that substantially. And I think that is one of the things we're going to use to help us get into the, to start dealing with some of the additional climate change problems. Because, for instance, the Chesapeake Bay folks are very worried about climate change because that means more stormwater, higher temperatures, more pollutants going into the. So it's not just more water running through these pipes and into neighborhoods potentially, but it's more water and pollutants running into the bay. So I think we can, I don't know how much more we can do, but I think we can do quite a bit more. And I think that's the emerging trend, and at least in one of the things that they're trying to do in addition to the infrastructure element of this.
Now, you mentioned roads. One thing that's interesting about Jan's portfolio is that he's transportation and environmental services, right? It's actually right there in your job title that they combine them. What about this idea of our roads being impervious versus pervious, right? So there was one of the city council candidates raised this issue of why are not our roads impervious? No, wait. But it's bad to have all of the roads be impervious, right? So like, can't we have porous roads? I would imagine that's more expensive. Sort of, what's the city's thinking on having porous roads?
So we do have some permeable surfaced roads now, and we've done a lot of green infrastructure. And I would be remiss if I didn't say we need to do more, a lot more. When you look at places like 4 Mile Run and the parks that we've developed there, where we have permeable pavers in place, we've got permeable sidewalk on portions of Commonwealth Avenue. Unfortunately, these are largely sort of small sort of spot projects right now, and I think the challenge for us is figuring out how we take these small spot capital projects and really sort of ratchet them up and apply them citywide, region-wide. And the challenge for road surfacing, obviously, if we were to just dramatically shift gears and begin making sure that all of our roads were permeable surface, well, it's more expensive. You have to remember that.
How much more expensive is it?
I think it depends on the.
Like twice as expensive?
I can't even tell you off the top of my head, because I think the estimates depend. Right now they're very contextualized. So there's a lot that goes into it. Depends on how well we can drain it. Depends on how much under drain infrastructure is required. But I think we are all going to be figuring out moving forward how we begin applying some of this sort of green infrastructure thinking to normal, routine, everyday infrastructure. That's going to be the challenge of over decades. That's where public works is going. And so there's actually there are a number of sort of disciplines within public works that sort of apply sustainability practices to how we're doing sort of routine things every day. And I think we'll get there, but it's going to take a lot of hard work over time.
So it's one thing for people to sit around in a room like this and talk about looking into the future and solving this problem. It's another thing if your house is flooding all the time. Katie, I'm going to throw it to you. Your neighbors there in Del Rey, I'm sure there's a growing frustration. And every time it's raining today, as if we planned it, we didn't plan it at Agenda Alexandria, it just happens to be raining right now. I would imagine there's like this level of anxiety. I'm wondering, among your neighbors, sort of what's the attitude and how the city's handling this? And you hear what Jan is saying right now. How is that being received amongst your neighbors?
Mixed bag. I think everyone understands the complexities of this and the scope and the funding especially. I mean, funding is the roadblock to everything. So if there was an unlimited budget and we could throw it all at it today, I think it would be a much better situation, but that's just not the reality that we live in. And I think people do understand that, but there is frustration. For instance, I have a letter from a neighboring neighborhood that they put together and submitted to the city, and we could change the date on it. We could change the name of the people in council and the signatories that signed off on it. And we could just resubmit it, and it was from 2006. Got another one from 2008, that talk about the same streets that we're looking at today, the same sewage issues we're looking at today. So people understand that it costs a lot, but when you've put $50,000 into your home, or I know of one family between Delray and Rosemont that every time something like this happens, it's about $100,000 worth of repair and loss to their home. A family that's lost their home insurance because they've had too many claims. People that are actually, one family almost had an infant drown in their home, and I believe have actually moved out of the city. So the mental weight of this is something that gets overlooked a lot because there's so many impediments to just getting things done. But it is certainly there. There's a collective sense of anxiety. There's a fantastic local weatherman on Twitter who puts out some really great information on rain rates and everything else. And I'm one of the people that I can't follow him on a daily basis, because if I know 2 weeks from now we're going to get a high impact storm for those 2 weeks, it's all I can think about. So I'll wait until the day the rain is coming, and then I'll follow along with what's happening. But that's my experience, and I have plenty of neighbors who are the same. And it's not, we've talked about this, it's not just Delray and it's not just Rosemont. There are people in Northridge around a culvert that have similar stories and situations and feelings, and there is a growing sense of anxiety, fear, and in some cases desperation, right? I mean, it's becoming a public health crisis, and I don't say that lightly. I say it from the middle perspective. I say it from the perspective of the homeowners who've had their back doors ripped off the hinges and their washing machines tipped over, and thank God no one in the family was in the room when that happened, because the force of the water coming in did it. You know, there's one family I've spoken to that they live in a one-story home. I should preface this. I get a little frustrated when this gets completely niched into these are basements that are flooding, because, you know, there are people who their main living area, their kitchens have been decimated, and they had to spend 6 months in COVID times couch surfing friends and families' homes with their children doing virtual learning while their home was being gutted and basically rebuilt. There's another family I know in a one-story home who, because of the drains in the alleyway behind their house and in front of their house, it becomes an island. And at this point, during one of the storms last year, the water came so high it almost crested their front porch into their house. And so they've got a boat at the ready in the house to jump in and leave if they ever need to. So it's not just a basement issue, and especially with some of the conversations around ADUs that we're having, and this idea that we want to try to make spaces on property where we can have aging family members age in place. I would never put my aging family member in my basement, because God forbid something happen and it's worse next time around, and that, you know, or a neighbor again whose door blows in. So it's beyond just the stress of what's going to happen to my home. We have residents that are really at this point fearful for their lives in some regards, or their children's lives, or their pets' lives. And so there's a lot of anxiety out there in the city right now around this issue.
Jan, what's the city's response to that? That help is on the way?
Well, I mean, I think the first response is to acknowledge the pain and the frustration and the anger that people feel. I mean, we spent a lot of time with residents and communities and neighborhoods all over the city, you know, after the events that we had back in 2019, but also in 2020 and into the first part of this year. And we heard a lot of really difficult stories, I mean, painful stories, and I hate hearing those stories. You know, even being one of them, being able to share my own, right? It certainly helps me empathize, but I think from top to bottom, those of us in the city, you know, we got into public works and public service because we want to make our community better, and so we, you know, the way that we see these things, that we've got to roll up our sleeves and work really, really hard. And I think that we are fortunate in that we have a team of really fantastic people at the city who are trying to make sure that people know who they can call when they need to. And when there are things that the city can do with immediacy, we are definitely trying to do those things. We're trying to be responsive. Those are the things that really matter to us, is make sure that people hear us. And sometimes that means that people are angry with us, and they're you know, and they are taking their frustrations out on us. And we have, those of us who are doing this have to remind ourselves time and again that, you know, I understand. I absolutely get it. So I think that's the first and the most important thing. And then the second thing is obviously, clearly, the work that we have to do. It's not only the big capital projects. You know, those are projects that are going to take several years, and they are going to be very, very disruptive and very messy. And that's work that certainly the city has to do, but it's also in making sure that we are increasing the frequency of the routine maintenance that we're doing. It's some of the smaller, what we call spot improvement projects or neighborhood improvement projects, where we can make sure we are addressing sort of what we consider our more isolated problems. If we can sort of address those things quickly and easily and impact a number of homes and properties, we're trying to make those go away. I think we're also having a conversation about priorities, because this is frankly a discussion about priorities for all of us, and we need to make sure that, you know, some of the challenging message that we need to deliver to people sometimes, that we can't get everything at one time, and we're going to have to make some tough decisions, particularly in the early years, where we're focusing our efforts on people's homes who are being impacted, and maybe we're waiting for a couple of years to get to some of the places where the impacts are, you know, we're seeing more street flooding, and I think that's going to be a challenging conversation that we're all going to have to move into. So yeah, that's how we see it. I think we're doing the best we can to relate to people and to understand and to listen and to to communicate.
So there's been a lot of discussion about Delray and Rosemont, but there is another neighborhood that has an issue with flooding, and that is Old Town. I'm going to turn it over to you, Charlotte. What about the businesses in Old Town that they've also got flooding problems, right? So what's their reaction to how the city's been handling this?
They're frustrated. And it's both Upper King Street as well as Lower King Street.
Everybody always focuses on Lower King
That's
Street,
right.
and every time it floods, the TV cameras come out. But
And
it's,
Andrew's been known to take his canoe along Union Street and paddle, float out there along Union. But it's a serious problem, and it affects some of the residents as well as the business community. So we have to be sure to focus on both Upper and Lower King Street. And that's been one of our biggest challenges and focuses for this past year with Old Town Business, is giving fair focus, fair look at Upper King Street as well as Lower. So it's really important to us to look at both sides of the street.
Andrew, did you take a canoe on Lower King Street?
I think it might have been Hal Hardaway who did that.
Oh,
I've
okay.
taken lots of kayaks. I would like to say something about those, because I mean we have the urban flooding issues that are the rest of the town related to stormwater runoff, and then we have the river, which is obviously one of our greatest resources in the waterfront. And I grew up in Old Town, so I've seen the river in in different flood stages and in different stages of pollution. And I think people are quite frustrated about how slowly it's taken us to get to some of the nuisance flooding issues. That seems to be, this can be 30 times a month, it can be quite a lot where you have small amounts of flooding. And then of course the other is, what are we gonna do long term? Since 1749, they estimate the river has risen about a foot just on its own, natural change with some climate change. And I think everybody understands that the river is an estuary, so we're right at the boundary between a tidal system and a regular river system that brings a lot of water. They estimate that we may have to raise, have some sort of flood protection for 5-6 feet by the end of this century. So this is another one of these problems that's not just that we have to solve right now, but we're going to have to solve in increments, even more severe increments down the way. So I think the flooding along the river, we need to really get on, working on that. And I'm not sure why it's taken us so long to get some of these issues resolved.
Why has it taken so long?
It's complicated. It's the flooding that's occurring along the river is occurring a couple different ways. It's the bulkheads are being overtopped. The outfalls into the river are backing up into the streets, and the inlets are filling up. And any of us who've spent any time in Old Town have been standing next to an inlet, and all of a sudden there's water coming out of the inlet, and that's water coming through the outfall. And then of course you've got a storm sewer system in that part of town that's significantly undersized. And that's again, that's one of the sort of primary challenges that we have when you look at older urban areas. Old Town, Delray, Rosemont, built in a time that didn't envision what we're seeing now. And so you've got a few different things going on. You've got maintenance to the system, and that system requires expensive repairs over time. It requires ongoing attention, and then it also requires some big replacement. And then when you're talking about not only increasing that replacement into a plan to turn your waterfront into a world-class destination, the decisions that you have to make are very complex. And again, that involves changing the way now for us, I think rightly so, it's involved changing the way that we look at water, and figuring out how we can build it into our long-term plans and plan and accommodate for it. But as you said, when you're looking at the Chesapeake Bay and the reports that I've seen, 1 to 2 feet, increasing, 1 to 2 feet by 2050, that's a big jump, and particularly even more beyond that. So that requires big investment.
I have a question. So Jan, do you think the city has I know we can always go out and hire consultants as they did with the storm sewer study. I guess my question is, does the city have the staffing and the expertise to do the modeling and the design work? For some of these things, because for instance, all the stuff that Katie's been talking about requires we need, I mean, the 2016 study was great because we started putting a lot of this data into a database so we could begin to see the risk around the city. So I guess my question is the city investing now into the kind of modeling and staffing that they need to work on these problems so that the city can feel, the citizens can feel like, you know, they know that we're moving forward and we're being able to assess the risk and provide, you know, up-to-date information to the community about the risks.
Yeah, I think so there's a fairly small team that's working, right, on, and when you look at the city, there's 9 people in the stormwater management division. And of course, we work closely in the stormwater group. We've got people on the maintenance side. We work with the Department of Project Implementation. We're working with Parks and Recreation. So there are a lot of people who are involved in this. And we've got fantastic engineers. But in the case of Casca and in the case of the work that we're doing on the waterfront, we are supplementing the talent that we have in-house. We're going outside and we're talking to some world-class firms and making sure that we are aligning the work that we're doing here with the best that we can possibly get. I think that that's what people expect us to do. So I think, and I think in particular with the stormwater utility now, with making more investments, not only in the brick and mortar work, I would say concrete and metal and all the detention facilities, all that, but we've also got to invest in our people. I think I appreciate you sort of making that point for us, is that we have to make sure that, and the city is competing now with other jurisdictions who are trying to bring in, we all know that water is going to be something that we're dramatically having to increase the amount of investments that we're putting in. So we're now all fighting for the same kinds of engineers and project managers and planners, and there's a premium on those people right now.
The future is in water, is what you're saying. Right?
I would, if I were advising a young engineer, I would suggest.
So speaking of the future, we are in a political season right now, and you have candidates who are running for office. Katie Waynick, I want to get your perspective on the candidates who are running for office. Not names, but just sort of in general. What are you hearing from them? What would you like to hear? And my experience with candidates is they tend to listen a little bit better as you get closer to election day. So might be your opportunity to speak to candidates that are watching right now. What would you say to the candidates who are running for city council right now?
So I've already spoken with a number of them and have had over half have come out, have done a walkthrough. I really try in that walkthrough not to point out my property and say, this is what happened to my house and I'm angry about it. I've tried to look at the larger scale kind of, I call it the Google map approach, and I look down at the watershed. I try to explain kind of what's happening upstream and do a 3 to 4 block walk, but then talk about a few more blocks down the road just to say this is how interconnected this is, and this is why this is not a simple problem. This is why we are different from waterfront issues. We are different from the combined sewer issues. There are little bits and pieces here and there that overlap and that are similar, but it is a much different problem. And I've really appreciated both the time that people have taken to do that, as well as some community conversations where we try to pull in as many residents as we can, just so these stories can be told and heard. I can spout them off all day long, but there's something about hearing from the person face to face that has experienced this to be able to get their take on it and their thoughts on it. And we have more coming up. So first, I really do want to say I'm not endorsing publicly anyone, because I think that this is one of those issues that it's kind of different from a lot of the other issues being talked about on the campaign trail, because it's kind of that basic level need. And so I don't want to make this discussion a political one per se. But thanking the people that have taken that time to come talk to residents, do a walkthrough, do a call. But really, I would also say keep listening. One thing I'd like to see in the future is this ad hoc group be more than just a year long. I think the fact that there was one back in, 2008, 2009, there have been a few along the way. I mean, Alexandria was built in an area that has always been very just water heavy, with interesting water tables and water resources, and the river's always created its own dynamic in this city. And I think that because of that, moving forward, there should be a more permanent group that can help be the facilitators and the liaison between the city and the residents and the business community, and really be able to get in that nitty-gritty, learn the details, and continue helping to move everyone forward on this issue. So there's a lot that I could say about it, but to narrow it down for the purposes of this, just to keep talking, to keep listening to residents, and don't ever think that you've got it figured out, because the first thing I tell people when they ask me a question about this is that you've got to know first and foremost what's happening on your property, because I can tell you what my street faces, but how that plays out at my house is very different from the house across the street. And you've got to know what's going on at that level to be able to then speak to the larger issues. And I'd say that to candidates too. You've got to recognize that this problem is unique in a lot of ways, and you're always going to learn something new, no matter where you go in the city or who you talk to about it. So just keep an open mind and keep listening.
Charlotte Hall, what's your reaction to what she just said about your ad hoc group being less ad hoc?
That's fine. But I think, as Katie will agree, we have to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. So we start on Thursday, June 10th, and let's go from there. We may find that we have some people who aren't as interested in staying longer than a year. Then we'll have others who might be sitting in the audience and say, hey, I think I'd like to be on that commission. I think I could make a difference. And I think that's part of it, is we need to be open-minded. We need to be flexible. We need to recognize that we have some very intelligent staff, high-quality staff sitting in City Hall and surrounding buildings. But we should recognize them for their talents. I mean, they are the professionals. So let's listen to what they have to say. We don't always have the answer. And as Katie has already pointed out, I have to remember that what I'm experiencing is not going to be the same. And we have to look at that. City staff may look at it one way. We may see it another way. So we have to, break bread, come together at the table. And I think we can learn from each other. All of us can.
Well, it's sad, but we're almost at our 7:30 mark. So I'm going to go around and get sort of final thoughts from all of our panelists on this issue. What do you want viewers to take away from this program? I'll start with you, John Lambert.
I want viewers to take away from this program that Alexandria has thrown a lot of resources at our flood mitigation response, and I'm proud of the work that we have done in the last few months building out the Flood Action Alexandria program. But we have an extraordinary amount of work still to do, and we know that, we recognize it, we look at it, and the work that we're going to be doing with our partners in neighborhoods and businesses across the city collaboratively, and we want people to know that we are going to be responsive and listen, and we're looking forward to making sure that the trucks continue running and we get the infrastructure we need in the ground.
Charlotte Hall.
Well, friendly reminder, we have all just come through one heck of a year working together, side by side, dealing with this pandemic. And we've survived, and we will thrive together. And we've worked beautifully with city staff. City staff and I know I've talked a lot about city staff in my short time here, but the city staff has really gone above and beyond. They've had to listen to agitated businesses, anxious residents, and they've had to double down on their work. But we've all come through, just hanging in there, being positive, and determined to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Andrew Macdonald.
Well, I think climate change is really going to force us to look much longer term than we ever have before. So we're going to have to really think about design standards, about development standards that match the conditions that we are facing already and we will face in the future. And that includes, I think, doing a lot more to integrate water quality and runoff controls, because they're both related when it comes to stormwater. And then I think the other is, which the city is doing a pretty good job of, really laying out the timetable for for addressing these problems to provide the maximum amount of mitigation we can in the short haul for the community, while showing them that we have a plan, a real plan for the future.
Katie Winnick.
I'd say get involved. I think the number one thing, you know, the city has a lot of resources that are out there. There are a lot of questions that people are asking that are fantastic questions, and the answers, you can already find them. So, you know, take a look at the website that they've set up. Follow Transportation Environmental Services on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. You get a lot of information that way, and it's really good. But also get involved. If you have a problem, there's a great way to report it. It's called Alexandria 311. I mean, there are a lot of ways to do that, and the honest truth is the city does not know that necessarily what your problem is until you let them know what's happening on your street. So don't wait for someone else to make that report. If there's something happening, let them know that, because that is the fastest way to have something taken care of. I mean, I know on my street, we see the trucks coming by and checking before big rainstorms now. So that has been a welcome sight. So just get involved would be what I would say.
All right, well, we've covered so much tonight. We've covered gray infrastructure and green roofs and blue roads. You could say we've covered the waterfront, but I won't say that. So this is our program for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. This is also the conclusion of the landmark 2020-2021 season, which has not really been the way that we planned it, but that's the season that we've had. We are going to take the summer off, but we will be back in the fall, hopefully at some point in person. So please join us at that time, and thank you for watching.